volete, ci sono solo... Can we hear this one to your needs? Yeah. Se volete, ci sono qui delle copie che riguardano una parte. Chiederei alla cortesia qualcuno mi divide un pochettino così per poterle dare a condividere.
Hello.
Yeah. Okay.
So I hope you can hear me well, also there. If at any time I should not be clear, please let me know, and I shall try to change it. So I'll be speaking in English.
That's fine.
With, that should be okay. I have no alternative, so you'll have to accept it. Or in Dutch. But, so thanks to Alessandro and Pietro for inviting me to come to this paper, and thanks to Alberto for drawing me in. And they specifically asked me to talk to you about the influence of Justus Lipsius' political thought on that of Hugo Grotius. So that's what I will be doing. First, as a general remark, the scholarship sort of until the end of the last century about that question was basically oriented on that of the German scholar Gerhard Oestreich, who studied Lipsius's political thought and concluded that Lipsius' political thought was the main theme of it was what he called neo-Stoicism. Being like a revival of the Roman Stoa of Seneca in terms of the social and political issues of the late 16th century. I never thought that theory fitted Lipsius' thought very well, and when I wrote my PhD about Lipsius' main political work, Politica, my conclusion was that the main theme of it is actually reason of state, and the main author, the main leading author there is not Seneca, but Tacitus, and that was already clear to everybody, because Tacitus is obviously the most often quoted author in the Politica, and one that's the entire type of thinking in the Politica is based on the Tacitian form of realism. And so there's very little space, in fact, for any political thought in the terms of Seneca, because that, of course, it's a Stoic, moralistic kind of thinking, and much in line with the traditional European political thought in a mirrors for princes tradition, whereas Lipsius is actually wants to propose a break with that kind of thinking. The core element in Lipsius's Politica, I'll be talking about it, is his views on religious policy. Yeah, that's the hardest nut that must be cracked in the historical circumstances and in the discursive context as well. And also talking about Hugo Grotius's reading of Lipsius, that it also seems to center primarily on the issue of religious policy, the relationship between government and church, and how the secular government is to deal with religious issues in their governing. So my paper will consist of 4 parts. First, I'll give you some backgrounds on the Dutch Revolt. Then I'll give a brief sketch of Lipsius's political thought. I will then do a similar thing for Grotius, focusing on his Annales on the Dutch Revolt, which he wrote in the first decade of the 17th century. And then I'll zoom in on an example of Grotius's practical thinking on religious policy taken from the 12 years truce that Alberto has also talked about, where we can see as I think we can see Lipsius' influence very clearly. Okay, this was just first some general things about the Dutch Revolt. I apologize beforehand if I may seem to underestimate your knowledge of the Dutch Revolt, but to get everybody on the same page, I thought it was useful to include a few comments. If it's too much, then I apologize. So the Dutch Revolt originated in the 1550s, early 1560s, with a growing discontent with the Habsburg policies. And the Low Countries at that time were part of the Habsburg Empire, were governed from Brussels with directions from Madrid, in the context of processes that we nowadays call centralization, there were policies to draw control of a whole range of issues to the central government in Madrid, and this taking away of political powers and responsibilities from the Low Countries and taking them to the center of the Habsburg Empire obviously caused resistance in the Low Countries. And that focused on a number of issues. And most practical probably was the discontent among nobility about appointments, where there was a tradition in the Low Countries that only noblemen from the Low Countries themselves could be appointed to important offices in the states. These appointments were now often filled by people with no history among the Dutch nobility. They just appointed from outside by the Spanish authorities that were regarded as strangers and foreigners in the Low Countries, whose appointment was forced upon the country, and that obviously caused resentment. Another important issue was the persecution of Protestantism in the Low Countries by the Catholic authorities. The Habsburg government, in cooperation with the Catholic Church, where the problem was played on two levels. One, there were large groups of Protestants in the Low Countries who obviously had suffered from these persecutions, but at the same time there was quite a lot of resistance against the persecutions among Catholics, because they objected to the cruelty involved in these persecutions. And so even among had a loyal Catholic part of the population, these heresies caused a lot of opposition and even resentment. And that opposition combined with the opposition against the movement of centralization that I mentioned just now, because the Low Countries had a tradition where every town was responsible for the persecution of its own criminals. So if you were, for example, if you were a citizen from Amsterdam and you were accused of a crime in Rotterdam, for example, you would be brought back to Amsterdam and tried in your own city. And so every city claimed the jurisdiction over its own citizens. Now they had these new religious courts that were the Inquisition that was established in the 1540s. Had broke that privilege, because this was a completely new court, but had nothing to do with any given town, but claimed jurisdiction over heretics. There were, as the towns claimed, that if these people had done anything wrong, their persecution was their own town's business, not this new court that nobody had ever heard of, and that was a completely newly introduced thing within the Constitution. It didn't even exist within the traditional ancient Constitution in the Low Countries. And so the very introduction of the Inquisition is not only a religious issue, but also a constitutional issue. And this reinforced the opposition both among Protestants and Catholics against the government. Similarly, in the 1560s, a new central taxation was introduced by the Habsburg government, which met with similar objections. Because in the past, if the king wanted taxation, he would send a request to the provincial states. The states would consider the request. In most cases, demand something in return for the money. There was a process of negotiation, and in the end, the money was granted by the states. Whereas in the new situation, the taxation was simply imposed while bypassing the constitution. So again, the constitutional opposition against the Habsburg policies was an important source of discontent. A very brief overview of what happened next in 1568. This opposition became a war. There was an actual fighting, and what follows is a story of alternating successes on both sides. The 1570s are roughly the decade where success is on the Dutch side, very broadly speaking, and ends with the institution of basically a free rebel state with its main basis in the west of the country. So the area north of Amsterdam and south of Amsterdam until the rivers in the south of the country. And so basically that stretch of area, reaching east until Utrecht, is liberated from in the Dutch perspective by the end of the 1570s. And the 1580s are the decade of the Habsburg answer with a fairly successful reconquest, a movement to push the revolt back to where it came from. And by the end of the 1580s, by 1588, 1589, the revolt is really in a very precarious position, and the complete reconquest by the Spanish seems imminent to some observers. Meanwhile, the Dutch are looking for assistance from abroad, so they first invite the French king's brother, the Duke of Anjou, as to become the new king of the Netherlands, and to bring in French military assistance. That experiment fails. Then they do a similar thing in England, where Queen Elizabeth sends the Earl of Leicester over with an army to basically try the same thing, and this also fails. However, then there is this kind of Deus ex machina, where the political and the joint political and military leadership of the Republic is taken over by two men, William of Orange's son, Maurice, and Johan van Oldenbarneveld, the political leader of the province of Holland, who together managed to reorganize both the state and the army in such a way that there is a new powerful answer against the Spanish. The reconquest is turned around, and the 1590s are the decade where the Dutch Republic in the north is basically consolidated definitively. And the fighting then goes on in the first decade of the 17th century, leading to the 12 years truce that Alberto has also been talking about in 1609, where the question of the final transfer of sovereignty is postponed. The question of the Indian trade is dealt with a compromise, and the religious question is basically left where it is, meaning that the north is Protestant and the south remains Catholic. So now, what is important to remember from this stories, and especially this slide, is that in the perception of some observers in the 1560s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, the struggle that's going on, which for many people is one of the sub-narratives of the European wars of religion, is not just war of religion, but it's also a political struggle. And it seems that perception of what's going on as had not just a religious struggle, but also, or maybe even primarily, a political struggle, at the time is a minority view. Had both Protestant and Catholic, Orthodox observers, and most of them see this story as part of the religious wars. But there is this other much smaller group of intellectuals who regard it as this complicated mixture of political and religious issues. And we're focusing today on people with that kind of perception of what's happening. And another important context to remember here, especially for Lipsius, is the French context. We had the French wars of religion, which are particularly bad in 1570s with the St. Bartholomew massacre, and 1580s ending with the murder of Henry III. So that is a breakdown of the gradual breakdown of the French monarchy over these decades, and complete failure to keep control of the country and confine and limit the scale of the fighting in France is clearly, it can be seen from Lipsius's correspondence, and this is an example that really frightens him a lot. And he, in Lipsius' perception, what's happening in France is had a near future in the Netherlands. So had this mixture of failure of the government to control civil conflict, plus had a religious extremism that leads to such fighting are the main components of Lipsius's theory. The main basis of Lipsius's thinking and the source of his fears, and had a main explanation of the general drift of his theory. So that's my next topic. The Politica, the Politicorum sive civilis doctrinae libri 6, which Lipsius published in Leiden in 1589. Followed by a second edition in Antwerp in 1596. Lipsius moved. He was a professor in Leiden from 1578 onwards, but moved back to the Catholic South in 1591. Whereas this imminent breakdown of the revolt is obviously an element in his fears, and he basically decides to go back to the south before it's too late, and he will be found on the wrong side of history. So in 1591 he's back, and by that time the book is under scrutiny from the Vatican Index of Forbidden Books, which leads to the publication of a revised edition in 1596. Which, however, is a very interesting book because Lipsius only fulfills some of the Vatican's remarks, but not all of them, and certainly not all of the most important objections to his text. So the second edition has at best masked the problems in his text, but has not actually repaired them. Well, what's in this book? It's written as a manual for a prince, and much like the nearest printer's tradition that we have in the 16th century in Europe. And it makes a call for a very strong central monarchical government, by a government that is basically unbound by other considerations and obligations than political ones. And so that obviously includes constitutional limitations, but also, very importantly, religious obligations. So that's where it connects very clearly with the reason of state tradition. The first edition that was to be censored actually mentioned Machiavelli in a positive way, very strikingly has a positive mentioning of Machiavelli, also a critical mentioning. And so it's not like he's accepting Machiavelli with everything that he brings in. But Lipsius makes it clear that we cannot afford to dismiss the realism in Machiavelli if we want to get on top of the religious strife in European societies in the 16th century. We will have to talk with Machiavelli and take on board his realism and his way to have his willingness to look at events and circumstances as they actually are, rather than how they look from the perspective of idealizing political thought or religious assumptions that we may have. And as to format, the remarkable thing about the text is that it's not a running text. It's not a treatise, but it looks like a commonplace. It is a collection of quotations from classical authors, which are connected by connecting sentences by Lipsius. So that means you could actually also use it as a commonplace book and use and mine it for interesting quotations from a whole range of classical authors on a whole range of political topics, which leaves unaffected that it does contain a very clear argument. All these quotes are connected by Lipsius in a very one-dimensional way. And so it is both a collection of quotations and a very clear argument heading towards Lipsius's conclusions. So here's a page from the book. You can see so the lines in italic print are quotations from classical authors, and the ones in Roman print are Lipsius's own words and definitions. And so it's really, as Lipsius says, a garment of quotations and his own work. It's all woven into one texture of his text on political power. One important thing to note there again is the choice of quotations. The emphasis is heavily on historians. The philosophers are present in the book. Of course, there's some Plato. There's actually a lot of Aristotle. But if you take all the Aristotle together and examine how Lipsius is using Aristotle, it doesn't amount to a whole lot of. It's not. There are no actual important points made in the quotes from Aristotle. The main thrust of what Lipsius is saying is entirely in his quotations from the historians. And that, of course, says something very important about Lipsius's book. The book is not, in fact, a work of political theory. It's a book about political practice. It's a book about the practice of ruling, using quotes from ancient historians about what happens in actual political practice. So that really sets him apart from political theory as such. And you can even say in fact it's not political theory. For him, reason of state is about rulers dealing with political issues in the real world, and he tries to stay as close as possible to what happens on the ground. Well, so here's what he says about religious bonds. That's book 4, chapters 3 and 4. His main distinction is between heretics who openly present themselves, who are openly visible, and those who keep their dissenting ideas for themselves. He does not name which faith is the true faith. So everything that he says is equally applicable to Protestant states or Catholic states, and he makes no difference. He accepts the general idea of his time that for political harmony, you need religious harmony. So that's book 4, chapter 3, saying that as a starting point, one Respublica should have one faith because it serves political harmony. And note that the argument he gives for it is political. He does not say one state should have the true faith because it's the true faith. He says, no, you have one Respublica should have one faith because it serves political harmony. So that means religious unity should be upheld as long as it serves that purpose. If the imposing religious unity should, in some circumstances, create more strife than it prevents, the suppression of heresy should at least be postponed. And so again, the integrity of the true faith as part of the king's business is submitted to political considerations. Then in the next chapter, he talks about heretics who remain silent, who keep their faith indoors. And in the first version of 1589, in the first version of that chapter, Lipsius argues that these people should just be tolerated. That there's no reason to persecute them there because there should be freedom of conscience. After objections from Rome, he comes with a complicated and twisted argument saying that these people should in principle be suppressed, unless again circumstances forbid. And then again he finishes again by emphasizing that persuasion is better than force, but clearly implying that again he is in favor of toleration. How much time do I have?
10 more minutes.
Okay.
Also even 15 if you need.
Okay. Okay. So so this theory originates in the 1580s. If I go a few slides back, that's the period from when the English Earl of Leicester was governing or trying to govern the Low Countries. And Lipsius was a supporter of that experiment. He regarded Leicester as had a strong power supported by the English monarchy that would arrange the Dutch polity and put things right. When Leicester's government began to fail and met with opposition from inside the Low Countries as well. He seems to have lost confidence in the Dutch Republic as a whole, and he began to plan his departure, his return to the Catholic South. And this decade, it's also the decade that Hugo Grotius was born. It was in this decade that the tensions between the religious moderates within the Republic, the Protestant religious moderates and the Protestant Calvinist Orthodox parties also began to be problematic. So when we're discussing Grotius, we'll again return to this decade in the 1580s, which in retrospect appears to be a very important, a seminal period in the political makeup, the political polarization within the Dutch polity. But first about Hugo Grotius. This is a portrait of Grotius as a young man, probably sometime after he left the University of Leiden around 1600. So Grotius was born in 1583. He was a student in Leiden from the age of 11 in 1594 for 4 years, where he famously studied under a great scholar like Joseph Scaliger and other humanist stars like Daniel Heinsius were his contemporaries, who all worked and thought under the influence of the late humanism, of which Lipsius is also, of course, one of the star people. And so Lipsius' influence is still hanging over Leiden in Grotius' years as one of an important intellectual influence. There is this a fashion of Tacitism going on in Leiden at the time, far into the 17th century. And so this whole reappreciation of the ancient historians, had a realist thinking, which is not only expressed in political thought, but also in medicine, in physics, etc., etc. It is a wave of it's the same wave that produced Galilei in Italy and others. It's this turn to realism, which also is the main influence on Grotius's thought. In 1598, he leaves university and eventually settles as beginning lawyer in The Hague, becoming public prosecutor in 1607. So he's on a career within the government. But he's also known as this a humanist star pupil from Leiden who already published books before he left university, and so in his political role, he is also welcomed as the scholar that he was at the same time. So within that role, he is asked in 1601 to compose a history of the Dutch revolt for the States of Holland, which he finishes in 1612 under the title Annales et Historiae de Rebus Belgicis. Sorry for the typo at the end. Which gives his Tacitist interpretation of the Dutch revolt. So the whole story as an overview and very much the political interpretation of it, rather than a documented day-by-day account of events. This is very much on the literary and philosophical side of stuff, trying to interpret and draw the political lessons from the Dutch revolt. Then in 1613, he becomes the representative of the city of Rotterdam in the States of Holland, which gives him an actual role in the government. And he becomes a close collaborator of Johan van Oldenbarneveld at the time when that government is more and more embattled within the same polarization that I just mentioned between between Orthodox Calvinists and had a liberal and political opponents within the Dutch Republic, and their conflict is about the relationship between church and government, and the respective roles of groups within the state. And that conflict leads to the fall of the Oldenbarneveld government in 1618, and the victory of Orthodox Calvinism within the Dutch Republic. So in this conflict, Grotius represents the group of people who basically think about politics in the tradition of Lipsius, saying where politics is about politics, and secular governments should not be burdened with obligations which are put on the agenda by, for example, religious agendas or constitutional agendas. Where the politics is about politics, and all the other considerations are of secondary importance. For Grotius, that does not apply so much to the constitutional level. That for him is very important. In fact, the entire revolt is a defense of the constitution. But the Lipsian thinking certainly applies to his religious views and his views on religious policy, where for him the power of the secular government comes first, and religion is one of the groups within the state that must obey the government. Okay, that view is clearly and deeply embedded in his history of the Dutch Revolt. These Annales et Historiae, written in the first decade of the 17th century, and they cover the period from 1559, more or less, until the truce in 1609, the Treaty of Antwerp again. First in 5 books of Annals, and then which cover the first almost 30 years in the space of about 115 pages, and then you get the second almost 30 years in 18 books, almost 500 pages. So there is a clear difference in narrated time, and the Annals are the short summary of what comes before the arrival of Maurice and Oldenbarneveld and the successful reconquest of the 90s, and they so this brevity makes a very clear connection with the brevitas in Tacitus, and he also borrows the entire political kind of narration that we know from Tacitus. And if in terms of the literary side of Tacitism in Europe, we were looking at probably one of the most successful imitations of Tacitus' style that were written. He said this is especially if you look at Grotius' ability to formulate Tacitian sententiae, what he does is really stunning. He really achieves in making sententiae that are indistinguishable from the ones that are in Tacitus, only they are not in Tacitus. And so he borrows the style. Of course, the title is obviously a reference to Tacitus. These are the Annals and Histories, but then of the Dutch Revolt. And so apart from the style, he copies Tacitus' framework of analysis, both on the friendly and the enemy side. Meaning that the role of the religious conflict is minimized. The entire explanatory framework is political. And this is the Dutch Revolt is a political struggle, not a religious one. And when organized religion still appears in the narrative, it's consistently in a negative role. It has always a source of problems of social strife, just stubbornness. It's never had faith as an inspiring thing for the good. It does not appear. It's faith is faith. Individual faith hardly ever appears. I think I found it only once as a motive for a person in a very marginal place. But whenever religion appears, it's always organized religion and always as a problem. And both on the Catholic and on the Protestant side. In that sense, he is impartial. And that says something about his position in the conflict. He's by no means on the Calvinist side. And the apparent aims of this, the two questions: why is he doing it? Also, there's no glorification of rebellion, and that's also very striking. Even it's an explanation of the Dutch revolt from the Dutch side, but without glorification of rebellion as such. And my conclusion about why that is that his aims are in the context of these truce conflicts. And his aim is to disqualify the Calvinist aims, to basically own the Dutch republics on the grounds that the revolt was religious wars, with the purpose of establishing a Protestant state. And now that we have it, then obviously the Calvinist Church it must be a main influence or a power within the Church. Grotius is trying to reject that view and basically had to prove that the revolt was never a religious struggle in the first place. It was a political struggle, and the outcome is political, and the new government must be obeyed also by their Calvinist citizens. Well, to round off my talk, I have a quote for you from after Grotius finished the Annales et Historiae, from the year 1616, when the Oldenbarneveld government, of which he was a part, was struggling to remain in power, and Grotius addressed the city council in Amsterdam about the how to deal with the religious issues at stake within these troubles, and where you can see that he has picked up the Lipsian view of religious policy that makes religious policy depend on the political circumstances. So you have the Dutch original is on the front of the page and an English translation on the back. I will read the English translation. And so Grotius addressing the City Council of Amsterdam. My lords, we think we have given your lordship good reasons for limited toleration regarding the contested religious points, for the use of state authority in this matter, and for the purpose of the decision of the states in this matter. And, a bit later he continues, for if toleration were not accepted, one of three things must necessarily come to pass. And so the background of this is that apart from the political question, there's also a religious question about predestination, where the Calvinist side is pressing for imposing one dogma on the entire country. It is the dogma of predestination. And on the other hand, the government, including Grotius, want to establish a more liberal church with a window, with the possibility of a window of ideas about predestination and a toleration of different views on this point. So, so with respect to the question of predestination, the religious issue at stake in this conflict, the government is trying to establish toleration. And Grotius says, so if toleration were not accepted, one of three things must necessarily come to pass. Either all ministers of the church must be brought to one opinion regarding these points, or those of one opinion must be expelled from the church service, or the existence of two churches in Holland and Friesland must be accepted. To bring all ministers to one opinion is impossible. From both sides, many passages from Scripture are adduced, many convincing arguments and many authoritative teachers, both from the early Christian and from the Reformed Church. That's what he's basically saying, and there's no point arguing about theology. And we cannot know the truth. Every side has its places in Scripture, and for the political debate, there's no point in discussing that. And so the question is political, not religious. And to expel those of one opinion from the church is neither Christian nor possible. To accept a schism within the Reformed Church of these provinces, which up to now, thanks be to God, has been won, is possible but highly dangerous. It is a true word that every well that is divided within it itself will be shattered. And so there he's borrowing again the traditional view that one state should best have one religion. Where at the same time we're also arguing for toleration. So then he continues. All political persons will easily note what problems this will cause in the state of the country. Illnesses of the public church always infect the public government, especially in an administration primarily held together by a shared religion. For if those ties are dissolved, the dissolution of the unity of the realm must necessarily follow, as well as enmities of province towards province, hatred of towns and factions, etc. On the other hand, if Christian moderation and well-defined toleration were accepted, we shall receive what we need most in its illness, it has peace and quiet. And so what they're proposing is a ban on discussing the contested religious issues within the church. And so during sermons, clergymen can no longer discuss predestination. And so you have a very curious proposal where on the one hand they're arguing for toleration, but then to protect toleration, they're going to impose a ban on discussing predestination in church. So, and the explanation for this is entirely situational. This is a purely political solution for the religious issue. It has nothing to do with religious truth or the authority of the church or anything. It's purely a political, it's submitting faith to politics, finding political solutions for religious issues in the situation of the moment. Basically, in the tradition of Lipsius's view of submitting faith to politics. Okay, thank you.
Bene, per la sua relazione, qua abbiamo concesso un emendamento linguistico, abbiamo un po' più di tempo a chiedere